whoever on the content team thought that people in their 50s and 60s is just universally wear top hats and canes.
Well, you have been wearing a lot of top hats lately.
I'm not a hat person, and I'm definitely not walking with a cane yet. But it is. I see what they're trying to say. You're at the point. And look, I don't mind sharing. Your peak earning years are going to happen somewhere between your late 40s and early 50s. So you are going to see key earning potential here still in your 50s, with the average American making right around $104,000 as a household. Financial mutants are right around $200,000, and then Abound Wealth clients $235,000. Still very healthy. You will notice a trend in a minute when we get to the 60s that this starts dropping down, but still in your 50s, a lot of opportunity to turn that into discipline that can turn into your army of dollar bills.
Well, and as they use that discipline to turn it in, we can see the average American from a liquid asset standpoint, the median amount of liquid assets available for the average American, about $67,000 for folks in their 50s. Very, very different from you guys, the financial mutants out there in the audience that consume this content. The median household investable assets is about $1.6 million. And for our Abound Wealth clients, median financial assets for those in their 50s is a little over $2.2 million. These are folks who have allowed time to compound. They have compounded good behaviors, and they now have an impressive army of dollar bills working behind them.
Well, look, this is where I'm just going to tell you, money gets really cruel at these stages when we get into the 50s and 60s, is because we talk about all the time the wealth multiplier. And when you're in your 20s, a wealth multiplier of 88 times over for a 20-year-old is pretty powerful. Even for a 30-year-old, it's 23 times. I mean, that's amazing when your money can 20 times up itself over just letting the money have time to work. The sad thing is by the time you reach your 50s, that number is as low as 3. By the time you get to your 60s, it's getting really close to one-on-one time for what your money becomes in the near future. I'm just sad to see that the average American never reached 1 times their income, because you add that with the realization that now you just don't have the time value of money to do compounding interest and compounding growth. It just is not a recipe for success. And that's what Bo's going to share with you on these money guy markers. It's more of the same, is it's a failed of what could have been for the typical American.
Yeah, as we think about our 50s, by the time we start our 50s, we want to have about 6.4 times our annual income in liquid investments. And by the time we leave that decade, we want about 13.7 times our annual income. So if you're going to have a target for your mid-50s, around age 55, this is the point where you ought to have 10x. You ought to be 10 times your annual income. So if we think about how the average American, the financial mutants, and Abound Wealth clients stack up, average Americans still just have not figured it out. 0.6 times. And again, time is now working aggressively against you. It's what Brian talked about. This is a cruel season. But if you have been doing the things that you're supposed to be doing, our financial mutants, on average, have an 8.0 time multiplier by the time they get to their mid-50s, and our Abound Wealth clients are right at 9.5 times. So again, right on target, right on pace, right on the curve with where you ought to be at this stage.
Well, and that's why we'll transition to talking about income in your 60s. This is where, man, it's hard to tell the difference. I mean, between the typical American, the financial mutant, and the Abound client, is because now we're not relying upon how big our shovel or our annual income is. Now we're relying on, hey, what did we do in our life from a disciplined approach to actually build up assets in the background? Because when you look in the 60s, realize most of us are starting to think about retirement or in retirement at that point. That's why you see the average American, the income is still right around $74,000. For a financial mutant, it comes in at $105,000 for household income. And then for the Abound Wealth client, right at 6 figures is $100,000. Like I said, this is not one of those things where you can compare and contrast and go, man, that's a huge difference. But man, oh man, in a minute we're going to get into net worth, and you will see a difference. But I think we ought to talk about the timing of, because just on the previous slide, a few slides ago, and we can pull this up too, there's a difference between your income in your 50s versus your 60s. It makes sense that now you're no longer It's just harder in the marketplace. You're going to find that you're not in your peak earning years, so you better have really turned something into some assets.
And a lot of people that have done the things that they're supposed to do, a lot of the financial mutants like you guys, a lot of our Bound Wealth clients, by the time you get in your 60s, you are financially independent. You're likely not working. So it makes sense. We see a large drop in the 50s and a large drop in the from 50s to 60s for both financial mutants as well as for our Bound Wealth clients. And even though we see that drop in income, what we don't see is the drop in total net worth. Because if we look at the total net worth on average for the average American, a financial mutant, and a Bound Wealth client, you can see that the average American in their 60s has a median financial asset load of about $103,000. We've just now, at this decade, crossed over to where we have greater than 1 times our annual income.
But that's not
up.
because of the discipline. That's just because
The
incomes
income
go
went
down.
That's it.
Like, congratulations, you finally have more assets than you have in income, and it's more likely, not because of your good behavior.
But our financial mutants, you guys that responded to the survey, you on average, you have a median household investable asset of $2 million in your 60s. And our Bound Wealth clients are just a little bit ahead of that at $2.2 million. So when we think about the mile markers, we know that by age 60, we want you to have about 13.7 times your annual income. And by 65, in order to be financially independent, a good mile marker to use would be about 20 times your annual income. Now, before you guys say this, we recognize financial independence is based on living expenses. So you may not need 20 times your annual income to be financially independent, but we don't know what your living expenses are. And it would be crazy of us to assume, okay, living expenses for someone living on the West Coast in the Bay is very different from someone living in the middle of the country in a rural town. So we're using multiples of income. So if you want to think about financial independence in your mid-60s, a nice rule of thumb mile mark would be 20 times your annual income. And when we see how the average American stacks up to the financial mutant who stacks up to the Bound Wealth client, you can see that the average American is just at 1.4 times their annual income. Whereas financial mutants, those that have been making the right decisions for an entire career, are at 19 times, and our Bound Wealth clients are at 22 times. You can see that those who made the decisions early on to make the hard decisions early are not having to make hard decisions later on in life. They're actually able to reap the fruit of their labor and hard work early on.